Castle Hill Lane, perhaps quite an unremarkable name, especially considering there are no castles nearby, and on first glance it may have rather an unremarkable appearance, a residential sidetrack here in this ancient forest. But one resident of this lane, once upon a time, was the very opposite of unremarkable. It was a great devouring dragon, but we'll get to that in a little while. First, let's orientate ourselves. We are here taking an evening walk in the New Forest in Hampshire, in the south of England, and Castle Hill Lane connects Pound Lane with Ringwood Road. We are on the edge of the village of Burley, and this topographical landmark that the lane follows is known as Burley Ridge. Now, at one end of Burley Ridge, the section we are at now, there was a location, a field, known as the Burley Beacon, where there was a beacon fire that could be lit in times of peril and was connected to a big chain of beacon fires across the landscape. The raised position of Burley Ridge allowed the beacon fire to be seen for miles around. Now, at the opposite end of this ridge, there is another landmark opposite Burley Beacon, and that is Castle Hill itself. This is an ancient Iron Age hill fort, but as we have around a mile walk until we actually get to the hill fort, perhaps we should fill the time on our walk by addressing the matter of the Bisterne Dragon, as it came to be known. Now, it's said that sometime in the mid-1400s, a great devouring dragon made its home near unto this beacon. I believe Burley Beacon is one of these fields just around here. And the fact that it made its home near unto a beacon means that somewhere in this vicinity, the dragon had its den. And every single morning, it would fly from its den on the Burley Ridge to the village of Bisterne, where it would menace and terrorise the villagers. At first, its hunger was merely for milk, and then that grew to mutton, and finally, maidens. And while the villagers attempted to appease it, attempted to give it offerings, every visit it made, it appeared to get hungrier and hungrier. Now, the lord of the manor was one Sir Maurice de Berkeley, whose family seat was up in Gloucestershire at Berkeley Castle. Now he, hearing the troubles that the locals were having, and him being a courageous knight, he decided to fight the dragon himself, to slay it. But others had already tried, and others had already failed. Accompanying him on the hunt were his two trusty hounds, two English mastiffs, known as Grim and Holdfast. So Sir Maurice de Berkeley, Grim and Holdfast, set up an ambush one morning when the dragon was arriving, but they soon found out that this dragon was no simple foe, and they had to retreat back to their manor and, well, work out a new plan. Now, on their second attempt, they decided not to attack him when he was feasting in Bisterne, but instead find his den and strike him there. But after all, this was his home ground, and the Bisterne Dragon, again, saw off Sir Maurice de Berkeley, Grim, and Holdfast. These three, licking their wounds, the knight and his two trusty hounds, they needed to find a solution. Sir Maurice de Berkeley thought for a long time and came up with quite a creative one. Now, how he came to think of this is a bit of a mystery. Perhaps a more common version of the story is that while out on a walk with his dogs, he noticed that his trusty hound, Holdfast, had stood on some holly and got it stuck on the dog's paw, and he had to pull it out, and, well, the dog gave some yapping, and it was all very sad for the dog, but Sir Maurice de Berkeley came up with an idea. What he would do is make himself spiky. make it so the dragon could not grasp onto him with its massive claws, make it so the dragon could not strangle him with its great tail. So he got some hide armour that he owned, and he pasted it with birdlime. Now, birdlime was a very strong adhesive used by the forest folk to trap small birds by pasting it on branches. When the birds landed on the branch, they would be stuck, and then the foresters would come along and have a meal. So, Sir Maurice de Berkeley pasted this birdlime on his armour and attached to it broken glass so that everywhere was covered so that the dragon could no longer grab hold of him, and, well, he thought maybe the third time there might be some more success. Now, he followed the same tactic as he'd had the first time, waiting for the dragon to fly to Bisterne and waiting for it to feed on whatever offerings the locals had left. Sir Maurice thus jumped out of a hiding place while the dragon was feeding, along with Grim and Holdfast, and they ran and charged at the dragon, which had seen them off twice before, so it wasn't quite so surprised as it was the first two times. But this time, when it tried to grab onto Sir Maurice de Berkeley, it found that its spikes and pricks and cuts were coming onto its long claws, and when it tried to grasp onto the knight with its long tail, it found that glass was getting stuck in beneath its scales, and it couldn't hold on to him very long. It could not crush him like it had attempted before. Thus, at last it was the dragon's turn to retreat, and retreat it did. It retreated all the way back to its den, here somewhere along the Burley Ridge, and Sir Maurice and his two trusty hounds followed. The fight continued here, and again Sir Maurice and the hounds gained the upper hand, and the fight continued to rage across the forest as the dragon was finally pushed from its den, and at last they came to just on the outskirts of Lyndhurst, in the heart of the New Forest, and there Sir Maurice de Berkeley, with his bow and his two trusty hounds, finally struck the killing blow on the dragon, and to this day there is a great hill called Bolton's Bench, and the hill itself is said to be the dragon's grave. You expect this to be quite a triumphant dragon-slaying tale, but alas, it does not end there. It had taken its toll on the knight and his two trusty hounds, and the two hounds were getting rabid and had clearly been gravely injured during the battle. Not only this, they had been infected by the dragon's poison, a poison that was in the dragon's very blood, and when it spattered onto them and their own wounds, it got into their system, and Sir Maurice himself, having just defeated the dragon, had to put both of his hounds down with his own sword. For 30 days, and for 30 nights after this, Sir Maurice de Berkeley was haunted by nightmares, and even his waking hours were like walking dreams. Weird, strange visions of the battle with the dragon. He too had been infected with the dragon's poison, and after the 30 days and the 30 nights, he returned to Bolton's Bench, to the site where he had slain the dragon and where he had buried his two trusty hounds, and he too breathed his last. Thus, at Bolton's Bench, the dragon, the knight and his two trusty hounds all met their end. The yew trees at Bolton's Bench are said either to have grown from the bodies of the knight and his two hounds, or grown from the body of the dragon itself, or alternatively they grew from the bow that was made of the wood of a yew tree that Sir Maurice used during the battle. In any case, there are yew trees atop Bolton's Bench to this day, and Well, the fact that there are 3 of them, I rather think they are the embodiments of Sir Maurice, Grim, and Holdfast, guarding the dragon. Sir Maurice Berkeley, the son of Sir John Berkeley of Beverston, being a man of great strength and courage, in his time there was bred in Hampshire near Bisterne a devouring dragon, who doing much mischief upon men and cattle, and could not be destroyed but spoiled many an attempt in it, making his den near unto a beacon. This Sir Maurice Berkeley armed himself and encountered with it, and at length overcame and killed it, but died himself soon after. This is the common saying even to this day in those parts of Hampshire, and the better to approve the same his children and posterity even to this present do bear for their crest a dragon standing before a burning beacon. Note in the margins of a pedigree roll held at Berkeley Castle, dated prior to 1618. Now, one may be quick to discount this story as mere folk legend, but what's so fascinating about it is how many references there are to the Bisterne Dragon and Sir Maurice de Berkeley, who was a historical figure. We know that he died around 1460. So there must be some seed of truth in the story. His descendants even had, as their crest, a burning beacon with a dragon set upon it. So, once again, there are records that make it out to be more than merely a legend. There must be some, as I said, seed of truth in it. And the branches are creaking. I don't know if you heard that. Where was I? It is also interesting to note that the date that the Bisterne Dragon, if we take it as the mid-1450s, then this was the same time as the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses. So the land, the country, was in chaos. So stories of devouring dragons, well, the chaos provided fertile ground for such things, and perhaps provided an opportunity for a dragon to make its den. Another point of note is the resemblance to the story of the Bisterne Dragon to that of the Lambton Worm, which similarly has a knight defending his local estates, has him using the tactic of spiked armour, and has a faithful hunting hound killed in the combat. We'll leave aside the story of the Bisterne Dragon for a time, as we've at last reached the hill fort itself. Now, the entrance here doesn't seem particularly noteworthy if you were just driving or walking through. There are 2 embankments on either side, but these mark out the hill fort. There's the trench just behind me here. On this side, the trench and the embankment. And again, here you can see the line of the Iron Age hill fort. Now, Castle Hill is a univalate hill fort. What does this mean? Well, uni means 1, valate means a raised defensive ridge. So univalate, 1 defensive ridge, 1 rampart. This is in contrast to a multivalate hill fort, such as the Badbury Rings that we visited last time, which had several concentric rings all leading to the central enclosure. The central enclosure here at Castle Hill is said to be around 2 hectares, which that's what, 20,000 square meters? So it's quite small compared to a lot of other hill forts, and there's not much left of it. Let's go on a bit of an explore, I think. Yes, let's go into the woodlands. Now, there's been little actual archaeological work done here, and if there were to be, it might be difficult, but we'll come to that later. I might stand still because the leaves are going to crunch too much. Now, there's been little archaeological work done here, so we don't know Castle Hill's exact age, but as a general rule, hill forts were built between 800 and 100 BC, when they became a lot rarer after that, up to about 43 AD, when the Romans arrived here in the south of Britain. So that gives us a start. And the fact that Castle Hill is a univalent hill fort might suggest, at least to me, that this hill fort is an older example, because from 400 BC, hill forts became much more complex in their designs. So we have a time period of 800 BC to 400 BC, perhaps. This simple example of a hill fort, smaller than many and univalent in design, that might suggest an older antiquity than some, although many of the larger ones, such as Badbury Rings or Maiden Castle, began in the oldest period and grew outwards. This seems to have been left a univalent hill fort. But I suppose it's all a bit of a mystery. Castle Hill is a pre-Roman camp of defence at the northern end of Burley Beacon Ridge. There is a fine view from here over the Avon Valley, Dorset and Wiltshire. Below the entrenched camp ran a Saxon herepath, warpath, along the line of road from Burley to Ringwood. Saxon herepaths usually followed the traffic lines of previous origin, which suggests the antiquity of this way. The New Forest by Heywood Sumner, published in 1883. Alas, due to the lack of archaeological evidence and archaeological digs, we have very much entered the realm of conjecture, so there's no way to know if it is within this 800 BC to 400 BC earlier range of hill fort construction in the Iron Age. It's perhaps interesting to note that out there on Kingston Great Common, there are several Bronze Age burial mounds. So we know that this area was inhabited much earlier than the building of the hill fort. And so there is a continuity in the landscape with these barrows and this defensive earthwork. You might remember that the Badbury Rings had a couple of Bronze Age barrows on its outskirts as well. Now, while we are in the realm of conjecture, there is another matter to address, and that is where precisely the entrance to this hill fort was. It is a general rule, again, when it comes to hill forts more generally, just as their construction is likely to have been between 800 and 100 BC, the entranceways, if there was one entrance, was usually facing east. This may have some relevance to the movement of the sun and even their religion, but we can't be sure. If there were two entrances, there would be one opposite the eastern one in the west, and Badbury Rings follows this design more or less, with its two entrances being east and west on the side of the hill fort. So, what's this path we're following? This runs north to south. So it is unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely that these entrances that you walk through today when following Castle Lane were the original entrances to the hill fort. If we go by the general rule, the eastern way, going to some private homes in that direction, may well have been the original entrance to the hill fort, or alternatively, one to the west, looking out over Kingston Great Common, where the Bronze Age barrows were. The only merit that a possible north-south entrance has is it follows the ridgeway, so the practicalities of the geography may be relevant and should be, well, kept in mind. Nonetheless, I favour the east and west theory here at Castle Hill because, well, it follows the usual design of hill forts, and the defence of the hill fort with an entrance coming from downhill on the west or merely one on the east, which is up atop the hill. Now this would be convenient when it comes to defence, as any attackers would have to come up the hill and round the hill fort to reach an eastern entrance, or alternatively, they would have to come up the hill to reach the western entrance. And if you've just fled from the pasture land over on Kingston Great Common, then you can shut the gate behind you. And, well, that's all well and good. Now let's leave the slightly shaky ground of Iron Age conjecture and make our way to some slightly more solid ground of, well, the post-Roman conquest Britain and the Anglo-Saxons, because it is relatively assured that down here you might be able to see a track. I believe that's the one I'm about to reference. There was an Anglo-Saxon herepath. Now, herepaths were a system of roadways developed by Alfred the Great that were used to transport soldiers, were military roads. They could also be used for trade and just for people to travel, as military roads were some of the safest. But these herepaths often followed much more ancient routes. They weren't like the roads the Romans built, all nicely paved and straight. These herepaths followed routes that, well, people and cattle had followed for generations. It has, I am aware, been urged that since the old English churches were chiefly built of wood, we are not likely to find any ruins. This may be so, but by no process of reasoning can the absence of a thing prove its former presence, nor need we pay any attention to the argument drawn from such names as Castle Malwood, a castle near Burley, Castle Hill on the banks of the Avon, Lucas Castle, and Bromley and Thompson castles in Ashley Walk. These are castles of the air, mere names invented, as in other parts of England, by the popular mind. At Castle Malwood there is the simple trench of a camp, and recent excavations there showed no traces of buildings, whilst the castle at Burley, and Castle Hill, and others, were merely earthen fortifications and entrenchments made by the Celts and West Saxons. The New Forest, Its History and Its Scenery by John R. Wise, published in 1867. It's interesting to note, or slightly frustrating to note for someone interested in hill fort research, that the herepath, if you follow it northwards, the herepath going past Castle Hill leads all the way up to the River Avon to Castle Hill at Godshill Wood, otherwise known as Frankenberry Hill Fort or Frankenberry Camp. And this is the problem with researching hill forts sometimes. It's not uncommon that they go by a few different names, and nor is it uncommon that quite a few share the same name. That makes it slightly frustrating when you're undergoing the research, because a few times when researching Castle Hill, I had to ignore references to Castle Hill, or Castle Hill for that matter. So yes, that's something to keep in mind. And now we reach what the retention rate of my last video suggests is your favourite part, the etymology of Castle Hill. Now, castle is of course a later attribution. There is no castle here, but it was likely called Castle Hill because of the resemblance of the embankments and the ditches to a traditional Norman Motte and Bailey castle. As such, Castle Hill has rather a generic name, but while we're on names, there is another name that is perhaps more relevant here, and that is a place I referenced at the start, Burley, the nearest village. Now, the name Burley, the start of it, Bur, this is much like the Bury we talked about at Badbury Rings. Bury comes from the word bur, just as borough is rooted in bur, and bur means a fortified place. So, Badbury Rings is Badder's Fort, Baden-Bury, Badder's Fort. Burley references a fortified place, and the Lee is a woodland clearing. So the name comes to mean a woodland clearing belonging to or beside a fortified place. Now, some say that the fortified place being referenced is the nearby town of Ringwood, but I rather lean towards the hypothesis that the burh, the fortified place in question, is in fact Castle Hill. Now, my reasoning for this is in part down to simple proximity. The nearest fortified place is, after all, Castle Hill, the hill fort, and Ringwood is several miles, I think about 5 miles away. Therefore, the fact that there's a fortified place here on Burley Ridge suggests that Castle Hill, the hill fort, gave Burley its rather delightful name. Now, the first reference to Burley is not in the Domesday Book. It seems to have been bundled in with nearby Ringwood as part of its property, but it comes in 1178 and is referenced for centuries after, sometimes with different spelling, but all suggesting the name Burley. So there's a consistency there. This brings us to the medieval era, and, well, we return to the Bisterne Dragon, and I don't know about you, but I rather think that a site such as this, near unto a beacon, that phrasing is quite important, I feel. The Bisterne Dragon did not make his den at Burley Beacon, but near unto a beacon. And, well, what better place to make a den, a dragon's nest almost, than this ringed fortress. But after the incident with the dragon, what of this place? It is known that in the 1800s there were smugglers in this area, and in Burley there is a pub, the Queen's Head, which has a cellar, a secret cellar, where smugglers would store their goods. So this pathway here may well have served as a track for smugglers in the local area. But that is not for certain. What is for certain is that in the 1800s, what occurred here, and what makes any archaeological dig very difficult, is, well, the 1800s were a time of great growth in this country, of building, of construction, and construction needs materials. And what was dug out of Castle Hill was gravel, tons of the stuff. It was said to have been a search for gravel. Whether or not they were also looking for the remnants of the dragon's treasure, or long dormant dragon eggs, that's another matter. But they certainly found gravel. So you can see that there are very big gouges out of the earth all throughout this hill fort. This is evidence of the gravel digging. This means that because of this quite large-scale digging project to take gravel out of the ground, it's very unlikely that much archaeological evidence is still in place, at least anywhere that the gravel diggers got to. Perhaps along the embankments, which are untouched, although once again this track may well cut through some of the embankments, so this hill fort has suffered over the centuries, but still it looks out over the New Forest, and, well, we are reaching its end almost. In the 1900s, local art figure, Hayward Sumner, who was a figure in the arts and crafts movement, a contemporary of William Morris in the late 1800s, he came to live around here in the New Forest, and he wrote of Castle Hill and even did an illustration of it in his study of hill forts in the local area. After this, well, Castle Hill has been affected by the growing of Burley, many more houses around it. It was, during the medieval era, a simple system of manor and tenant farmers, but in the late 1800s, in the latter end of Queen Victoria's reign, and into the 1900s, Burley grew into a quite sizable village and tourist site, and in the 1950s came to be known for its connection to witchcraft, thanks to a local resident, Sybil Leake, who lived there in the 50s and was known to have a jackdaw resting on her shoulder as she walked around. And this association with witchcraft in the local area grew over the decades, and in the modern era, there is a fairy festival that occurs every summer on the grounds of Burley Manor, which makes this place not merely associated with dragons and witchcraft, but fae folk also. It really is an enchanting place to visit. Some legends are invented later, from half-forgotten events. Others spring to life at once. Within a year, the whole county knew of Sir Maurice Berkeley's battle with the Bisterne Dragon. They knew the dragon flew over the fields from Burley Beacon. They knew the knight had killed him single-handed and died of the dragon's poison. And if the wider world was soon distracted by the nightly dramas of the Wars of the Roses, in the New Forest and the Avon Valley, as the years passed, men remembered, we had a dragon not so long ago. Edward Rutherford, The Forest, published in 2000. Now, as we reach the other side of this hill fort, there's not much else to say really. In the modern day, it is mostly a through track for traffic and a residential track for the homes that have built up along Castle Hill Lane, sorry. But this ancient Iron Age earthwork that we are now exiting, perched atop Burley Ridge, has looked out, has inspired stories, has provided generations with inspiration and gravel, and to this day it is still worth a visit if you're in the local area and interested in what I was saying about through traffic. Let's get to the side. Now that element of a visit is not quite as enchanting as the hill fort itself. Should we go along the high road or low road? Let's go see if the high road goes any... Oh, it becomes a dip. This is the conclusion to this Hill Forts on Hill Forts. We've left the hill fort itself, but, well, if you can have a preamble, I suppose this is a post-amble. Returning to the story of the Bisterne Dragon, now there are as many different versions of it as there are storytellers who have told it over the centuries. Even my version was a mix of different elements that I've read in my research, and, well, it's interesting that this story has been so potent over the centuries. I said that the first reference is in a pedigree document dated prior to 1618, and, well, there are references to it all over the landscape in the local area. And I understand that some watching this may feel I focus more on the Bisterne Dragon than I have the hill fort itself in some respects. This is not an unfair criticism, but unfortunately, with a hill fort like this, there is very little solid evidence to remark upon. There's no real archaeological digs that have occurred here. There was, I think in the 90s, a report by an archaeologist who oversaw the laying of pipes for some of the homes, but nothing noteworthy came of that. So still, there's nothing we know for certain, or any artefacts that we know have come from Castle Hill. As we've started this walk, we may as well continue along Castle Hill Lane until we reach its end. But I wanted with this Hill Forts on Hill Forts, the second one, to look at a more obscure hill fort. Badbury Rings is such a massive, impressive, well-known example of a hill fort. So visiting there, well, you have a lot to say, you have a lot to see. But Castle Hill, in contrast, is an obscure example of a hill fort, but nonetheless, I feel worthy. The range of hill forts throughout the country, spread throughout particularly south and southwest England and Wales, and also up in Scotland. There are hill forts elsewhere in the world of similar designs, and there's one in Norway that I would like to visit one day. I can see traffic ahead, so we're reaching the end. Across the road from Castle Hill Lane, across Ringwood Road, there is an example of a very old milestone. So that is where we will end our journey today. I hope you've enjoyed this Hill Thoughts on Hill Forts. If you have, please do like and subscribe if you feel so inclined. And if you would like to join me again on another Hill Thoughts on Hill Forts. Thank you.